Right. Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to tonight's News Spotlight White Beam discussion, Freedom from Fear, an Incomplete History of Liberalism. My name is Alexander Schwittek. I'm project coordinator at the Center for Liberal Modernity based in Berlin, and I have the pleasure of moderating our conversation tonight. This event is hosted by NOUS, as you may already know, the Network for Constitutional Economics and Social Philosophy, an interdisciplinary initiative that brings together scholars and thinkers across humanities and social science. And at this point, a special thanks to Karen Horn for organizing this splendid series of events. And our title today, Freedom from Fear, our topic is directly taken from Alan Kahn's book, Freedom from Fear, an Incomplete History of Liberalism. I have it here with me, published in 2023 by Princeton University Press. And in his work, he traces liberalism not as a fixed doctrine, but as a restless, evolving tradition, and a tradition that is specifically driven by the ambition to secure freedom, and not just only from perhaps tyranny, but from fear itself. And tonight, we aim to unpack the unresolved tensions at the heart of liberalism when it's viewed through the lens of fear and its own incomplete history, to better understand liberalism's capacity for self-critique and perhaps its renewal. And we are fortunate to do that with two thinkers who have each, in their own way, challenged and deepened the discussion of the liberal tradition. And joining us are the author of the book himself, Alan Kahan. He's an historian, political theorist, translator, and travel writer, and he's professor of British civilization at the University of Versailles. And in his works, generally speaking, he traces the liberal tradition through Enlightenment thinkers and beyond. And as an author of several books, he's in particular an expert on Tocqueville and the 19th century's liberalism. And next to him, we have Professor Sabine Döring. She's a professor for political philosophy at the University of Tübingen and is a former state secretary at the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. In her work, she explores the connection between emotions, reason, and moral judgment, and is also working on a liberal theory of the common good. So thank you both so much for being here with us today. Before we begin with the discussion, just a quick word on the structure of tonight's event. First, Alan Kahan will present his book, Freedom from Fear. And after that, Sabine Döring will offer her response and reflections on the book and the broader topic. And after their contributions, there will be the chance for you audience to engage with us and with our guests, and we're gonna have a general discussions on the topic discussed. So, without further ado, Professor Kahan, please, the floor is yours, and I know you brought a PowerPoint presentation, so please share it with us. And again, very welcome.
Thank you very much. I'll share that PowerPoint in a moment, but first I wanted to thank Karen for arranging all of this and for inviting me to present. And one other personal note here, if it appears that I am breaking down into tears, it is not an intellectual reaction nor yet an emotional one. It's just that allergy season has arrived and this happens. Okay, so I will now attempt to master technology once again and share my screen. And I will hit the share button. Okay, you should all be seeing it now. If that's somebody with, yes, okay, great. So I think that many, if not all of you, received the first chapter in advance. I'm not going to attempt to do too much summary of the book, which would be rather difficult in my 15 minutes in any case, but just I will do a brief recap of some of the main themes of the book. And then I thought it might be useful if I discussed briefly some of the criticisms, both unjustified and alas justified, that I've received in the reviews that have come out to date. So to start with the definition of liberalism that the book starts from, I spent a lot of time looking for a one-sentence definition of liberalism that would be comprehensible to the ordinary person and not entirely meaningless from an academic perspective. And what I came up with is that liberalism is the search for a society in which no one need be afraid. And no one means no one. Not rich people, not poor people, not women, not men, not heterosexuals, not homosexuals, not people of this ethnic group or that skin color, no one at all. And this is the goal of liberalism. You will, of course, have recognized that no liberal society has therefore ever actually existed. Liberalism is, in fact, a utopian movement. As I see it, that is to say, it is attempting to create a world that has never yet actually uh, been there. But we hope one day. Okay. So fear is a very broad and vague term. Many of you will recognize it from Judith Sklar's Liberalism of Fear. One of the things that differentiates my work from her is that I insist on historically conjugating that fear. So if I can make my slide move, which I'm trying to do, and failing, there we go. There have been four historical fears that have dominated liberal thought. In the period before the French and American revolutions, that fear was mostly a fear of religious persecution. You can think about Locke here and many others, linked to royal despotism. After the revolutions, there was a fear of revolution itself, and on the other hand, a fear of reaction that dominated liberal thinking. Liberals tried to figure out ways in which we could avoid both revolution and reaction. That was the dominant set of liberal fears during what I call the short 19th century, which ended more or less vaguely on the 8th of May, 1873, when John Stuart Mill died in Avignon. And that began the fin de siècle, the period between then and the First World War, when what most concentrated liberal minds was the fear of poverty. And then after World War I, running down to the end of the 20th century, it was the fear of totalitarianism that was uppermost in the mind of the average liberal. Okay. So each of these four fears gave rise to four historical liberalisms, what I call proto-liberalism, based on the fear of despotism and of religious persecution, that from the roughly 17th century until the late 18th century. Why do I call it merely proto-liberalism? Because until then, as Helena Rosenblatt and others have demonstrated, the word liberal did not actually have a political meaning. It meant generous, it meant broad-minded, it meant perhaps a bit heterodox in your religious views, but it did not say anything about your politics per se. Liberalism proper begins with the fear of revolution and reaction after the revolutions, with due apologies or acknowledgement to Microsoft. I call this liberalism 1.0. The fear of poverty, which dominated in the fin de siècle, gave birth to liberalism 2.0, both greatly concerned with poverty and how it was going to be fought. Of course, poverty is not a new thing. It isn't invented in 1873 when Mill dies. It's been with us always. But the idea that you could actually do something about it is a relatively recent one. After all, if we took England in 1832, the world's wealthiest country, and distributed all the wealth equally, the result would have been that everyone was very poor. It's only when the world has a certain amount of wealth that the idea of actually fighting poverty, diminishing poverty, becomes plausible to anybody but a handful of crackpots. And the modern liberals, who are the majority of the liberal movement in the fin de siècle, are people who wish to use the state to help in the fight against poverty. They are opposed by people who call themselves classical liberals. Classical liberal as a term is invented in this period. Modern liberal is my coinage. Uh, Modern liberals are people like the new liberals in Britain, progressives in the United States, solidaristes in France, social liberals in Germany. Think Friedrich Naumann, for example. And they are opposed by classical liberals who think that engaging the state to fight poverty, A, will not help with poverty, and B, will create an ever more fearful state. Not so much priests allied with the police as taxmen allied with the bureaucracy. And then liberalism 3.0, in response to totalitarianism, um, kicked off in the famous Kolok Lippmann, introduced to me by Karen some years ago, dominated by the end of ideology movement in the 1950s, by people like the Ordo liberals, more or less at the same time, and then later on by the egalitarian liberals. I think about John Rawls, libertarians, Robert Nozick, and so on. And those were the leading forms of liberalism. And one thing I do wish to make is a methodological point. Liberalism is an oyster, it is not a tree. If you think about the tree or genealogy images we so often use in the history of political thought, I think those are all a big mistake with any major historical tradition, but particularly with liberalism. Why is an oyster better than tree? First of all, it tastes much better. Second of all, unlike trees, it has aphrodisiac properties. And third of all, when you think about a tree or a genealogy, well, the tree starts from a single seed. The genealogy has a founding father or founding mother. Liberalism has no individual who's ever claimed to be the first liberal. It's in this sense really the organic political philosophy of the West in the modern period. And unlike trees, which tend to have a central trunk and lesser branches that drop off, when you look at that oyster, you can see every layer that it ever created, all at the same time. Just because liberal fears shift does not mean the old ones disappear, and some people never adopt the new ones. So liberalism is an oyster. It has four big layers, but I'm happy to add more if people like. That's why this history is incomplete. If something's missing, don't blame me. Write your own book and add another layer to the story. And of course, now we're confronted with a fifth fear that is concentrating liberal minds: populism. There is some debate about whether populists are Democrats or not, but there's no debate about whether populists are illiberal or not. They most certainly are illiberal. And in my terms, why are they illiberal? Because they always want to make someone afraid. Sometimes people of the wrong religion, sometimes people of the wrong ethnicity, always immigrants, but always someone needs to be afraid, ought to be afraid from a populist standpoint. They are the illiberal movement of the moment that is occupying the liberal world, alas. One other main theme of the book, there are several others I don't have time to discuss, is that until the late 20th century, liberals typically argued in terms of three pillars. They had political, economic, as well as moral and even religious arguments for liberalism. Freedom, markets, and morals is how I describe these three pillars. Not every liberal talked about all of them, but they all at least acknowledged the importance that if you wanted a stable liberal society, a stable liberal government, you needed to have support from a political system, a constitution, for example, an economic system, a free market, and ideally free trade, and a set of moral and religious beliefs that provided support for liberalism. One of the contentions of the book is that while there were always some liberals who tried to build a one-pillar liberal, I discussed them in one chapter of the book, most liberals were three-pillar liberals until the post-World War II period, when increasingly liberals limited their arguments to only one, sometimes political procedures, Mr. Rawls, sometimes economics, Mr. Friedman, but typically by eliminating or reducing to a useless stub any kind of moral or religious pillar for liberalism and abandoning any kind of moral and religious language as contraindicated from a liberal perspective. And I am calling on liberals in my final chapter to repent, to return to the three pillars, because human nature abhors a moral vacuum. And when liberals don't talk about morals, they will lose elections to people who do, namely, in this case, populists. liberals need to go back to talking about politics and markets and morals, even religion, not necessarily traditional religion, but religion, if they are going to convince people of the liberal case. Um, so that's, in a nutshell, the major set of themes of the book. One thing I haven't talked about here, or put in a slide, is that liberalism is not just about fear, it's about hope. That's how come it can be utopian. We can discuss some liberal hopes later on. So that's the 10-minute version of the book. So I wanted to spend what little remains to me of my time talking about some of the reactions um, that it has gotten. So I will start with the unjustified criticisms and move on to the justified criticisms. So the first one is about my treatment of Locke. Locke is essentially absent from the book, and this has upset some people very much. Mostly Americans, occasionally British people, who want to see Locke as central to the history of liberalism. Now, very little of what I have to say about Locke is actually the result of my own research. About 95% of it is borrowed from the work of Duncan Bell and Timothy Stanton in Britain, um, and Gail Arsena in the United States, demonstrating that even in America, even in Britain, Locke is just not considered, either not considered a liberal at all in the 19th century heyday of liberalism, or considered a really marginal figure. The only thing that I added to this was confirming this in some of the German literature of the time. If you look at the Staatslexikon or Blunschli or other 19th century classic liberal documents, Locke plays either a minor role or no role, or is just considered not a liberal. Um, Second criticism that I've gotten, and I really don't understand this one, but it most recently came out in a review by Greg Conti um, at Princeton. The claim is that, well, nobody wants anybody to be afraid. This doesn't separate liberals from anybody else. And yet, of course, many other political traditions want some other group to be afraid. Communists want the bourgeoisie to be afraid. Racists want people of the wrong group to be afraid. Certain kinds of conservative want people who are not of the right religion to be afraid. And they think it is just and appropriate for these groups to be afraid. So I really don't understand why so many serious people actually seem to think this is the case, but clearly they do. And, I put a line about this in the book, but obviously that wasn't enough. And the most recent sort of odd point is to try to argue that late 20th century liberals, for example, Milton Friedman, but one could name others, are in fact really engaging in moral discourse. And so again, to pick a line from a recent review, somebody said, well, if Friedman can write a book called Freedom to Choose, obviously that's a moral claim. To which my response is, he says, Friedman does indeed endorse a freedom to choose, but he tells you little or nothing about what you ought to choose once you have that freedom. And that is the essence of most moral discourse, most religious discourse, any kind of perfectionism, which, to return to a term that is used in the book, has often been characteristic of liberalism alongside utilitarianism. So those are three common but unjustified criticisms. And then just to wrap up quickly here, two, I think, more justified criticisms, at least in part. I include Raymond Aron among those in the end of ideology school. That's a little bit unfair to Aron. Certainly, he said end of ideology type things, that the world was better off without ideological commitments for a short period. But pretty clearly, he moved away from this view after the 50s and early 60s and adopted a rather different set of positions. I don't really take that into account, and I should have. The other is not something I didn't take into account, but alas, it got buried in my discussion of John Stuart Mill, and therefore lots of people have not noticed it. So some people say, well, look, liberals don't mind certain kinds of fear. Competition makes some people afraid, and liberals are in favor of competition. It makes sense for members of various traditional religious groups to be afraid of atheists arguing against them. So liberals do support fear, just like everybody else. Now, I discussed this in the context of Mill, but it's capable of a much more general response. Um, when people run a race, you can talk about them being afraid of the competitors. What they're really afraid of course, is losing. But in a race that's run according to liberal rules, what they don't have to be afraid of is the competitor tripping them, hitting them with a stick, cheating, or simply forbidding you to run in the race. Liberals won't permit that kind of interference. So worry about losing a race, well, that of course is natural to anybody who competes. None of us like to lose. But that's quite different qualitatively, I think, from the fear that you will not be allowed to run, or that you'll be forced to start 50 yards behind, or that somebody's going to break the rules and trip you. And so I think I needed to have talked at greater length about this kind of fear and how it's not really part of the universe of things that the liberals ought to be or are concerned about. Just as I said, liberalism can't free you from the fear of the dark or from the fear of death. Liberalism can't free you from the fear of losing the race. Indeed, it's going to force you to race. But this does not, I think, in any serious way invalidate my definition of liberalism as the search for a society in which no one need be afraid. Okay, I will stop there. I think within my time limit even, and turn things over to Sabina, and I will stop sharing.
Almost. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alan. And now, Sabina, I want to give you the chance to share your slides and your reflections on Alan's ideas and his book.
Let me first say thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure and an honor. Thanks to Karen for all the work and the organization and the work that is currently still going on while organizing the discussion. And thanks for having a philosopher here. My apologies that you will hear a bit about conceptual analysis partly. This is the outline of my talk. I will start with a few methodological remarks. Surprise, surprise. Then I will turn to the comprehensiveness of liberalism, by which I mean the question of whether liberalism necessarily includes a liberal ethics, not only historically so, but necessarily conceptually. And then I will ask whether this morality should be perfectionism, and my answer will be no. And then I will say a few words about freedom from fear. Okay, here we go. The current crisis of liberalism has prompted a return to its history in an effort to recover neglected resources within the tradition that may inform responses to present challenges. Alan's book joins several recent volumes animated by this impulse, starting from the premise that, as Matt Sleet aptly observes, quote, not knowing what they are fighting for, liberals do not know how to fight for it. There can be no doubt that any meaningful update of liberalism, version 4.0, perhaps, head tip to Alan, must be grounded in a historically informed understanding of its earlier iterations, their insights, ambiguities, and blind spots. Alan's book makes an indispensable contribution by uncovering conceptual resources that might otherwise be overlooked, and by offering critical distance from contemporary assumptions that present themselves as self-evident. Yet, precisely because the historical lens reveals how deeply liberalism has been shaped by context, it also brings into focus the discontinuities between past and present. The question is therefore not simply what was once good or promising, but what responds adequately to the circumstances of today. While historical inquiry enables valuable comparative analysis to clarify what is distinctive about our current moment, it also shows the limits of historical insight when it comes to shaping future-oriented liberalism. Old medicine does not cure new diseases. For this reason, es geht jetzt nicht weiter. Nur noch zurück. For this reason, the historical comparative approach is best suited to clarifying what is new in the present context. By contrast, designing a forward-looking liberalism requires a systematic perspective, one that asks what the core idea or core ideas of liberalism are, rather than seeking to revive a lost golden age. Liberalism, after all, is a progressive tradition. It embraces change, even disruptive transformation, driven by individual insight, rather than functioning as a conservative project of restoration. A further strength of the systematic approach is that it offers normative criteria to discriminate genuine continuations of liberalism from those that, while drawing on its language, may have strayed from its core commitment. This is especially relevant given the central concern of Allen's book and of many liberals today, the rise of populism, which persistently invokes the rhetoric of freedom. Obviously, I've now placed myself in the uncomfortable position of having to deliver on the question, what, if anything, can be identified as the normative core of liberalism. Despite liberalism's internal diversity, one unifying commitment can be identified. Gerald Gause has formulated the fundamental principle of liberalism as the premise that authority and law must be justified to be legitimate. John Stuart Mill famously insisted that, quote, the burden of proof is supposed to be with those who are against liberty, who contend for any restriction or prohibition. The a priori assumption is in favor of freedom. This presumption is echoed by many later liberals, such as Joel Feinberg or John Rawls, for example. Unsurprisingly, then, all strands of liberalism regard liberty as the grounding political value. This stands in tension with Allen's thesis that liberalism rests on three pillars: freedom, markets, and morals, or to put it another way, I'm quoting Allen, politics, economics, and religion or morality. The question is whether markets and morals are truly co-equal pillars, independent normative foundations of liberalism alongside liberty, or whether they are better understood as integral parts of the concept of liberty itself. This raises two further questions. First, to what extent is liberty conceptually or institutionally dependent on private property, thus establishing markets as an implication of liberty, as classical liberals have maintained? And second, how comprehensive is liberalism as a doctrine? Is it confined to a theory of political legitimacy, or does it also entail a broader liberal ethics? And if so, is such an ethics implied by the very concept of liberty? I will focus here on the second question. Allen argues that historically it has been the moral pillar of liberalism that has played the most central role. Few, he suggests, believe that liberal political or economic institutions could be sustained without some shared understanding of the kinds of lives individuals ought or ought not to lead. In fact, what contemporary ethics and political philosophy refer to as perfectionism, he presents as a liberal response to the populist challenge. A key strength of Allen's book lies in exposing the fact that a neutral, moral, independent conception of liberalism has become hegemonic in public discourse and in many liberal democracies today, even though this conception is historically detached from and in some respects alien to the liberal tradition itself. This view reduces liberty to what Isaiah Berlin famously termed negative liberty, that is, freedom from interference or freedom from coercion. However, the missing liberal morality is not an independent pillar of liberalism, external to the concept of liberty. Rather, it is a logical implication of understanding liberty as a normative concept. We arguably all agree that freedom from interference is valuable. That is, that the concept of negative liberty is a normative concept. But what then is the source of its normativity? I would argue that it lies in the fact that negative liberty protects something that in itself is worth protecting, something that deserves to be shielded from interference. What is being protected, I contend, is positive liberty, conceived as the freedom to act. That is, the capacity or opportunity to realize one's potential and to pursue self-determined goals. In this sense, negative liberty is ultimately justified by its role in enabling positive liberty. This means, as Gerald McCallum already demonstrated in the 1960s, that there are not two independent concepts of liberty, but rather a single unified concept that encompasses both negative and positive liberty, a view later endorsed by John Rawls. In the 1970s, Charles Taylor offered an important elaboration of McCallum's insight. He argues that negative liberty, understood merely as the absence of external interference, becomes conceptually unstable when detached from normative criteria. Without some moral framework for determining which actions or pursuits are worth protecting, there can be no principled basis for adjudicating between competing claims to freedom. Any restriction could be framed as a violation of someone's liberty, unless we are able to distinguish between mere interference and interference with something of recognized normative force. A conception of negative liberty detached from moral criteria is thus not only historically incoherent, as Allen rightly observes, but also incoherent. While Allen highlights that liberalism in its classical forms was never morally neutral, the stronger claim, one that goes beyond historical reconstruction, is logical in nature. Freedom cannot serve as a guiding political value unless we distinguish between uses of freedom that are worth protecting and those that are not. Even Rawls, the most prominent advocate of neutral liberalism, acknowledges that political liberalism depends on an overlapping consensus of moral ideas shared across diverse worldviews. The notion that everyone may do as they please, as long as they do not harm others, only works if we have already agreed on what counts as harm, which is a moral judgment. Thus, even the so-called neutral liberalism rests on implicit moral foundation. How then can we distinguish between uses of freedom that are worth protecting and those that are not? Allen's answer is that liberty requires a certain moral ethos to be sustainable, one that aims to liberate individuals from the fear that inhibits autonomy. He advances a form of perfectionist liberalism, an account that singles out particular instances of positive liberty as valuable, namely those that, in his view, best promote human flourishing through the cultivation of moderation, civility, and ethical responsibility. Even though Allen does surely not intend to impose the doctrine of the good life, any perfectionist conception of liberty is by design exclusionary. Affirming certain ways of life as superior necessarily implies the devaluation of others if, moreover, state resources are used to promote liberal perfectionism. It not only advances the supposedly superior values, but also restricts the freedom to pursue those deemed less worthy. This is perfectly the concern raised by Matt Sleet, who argues that even a mild perfectionist liberalism risks alienating those whose values, often traditional, religious, or communitarian, are implicitly judged as deficient. For many critics of liberalism, the problem is not that it lacks a vision of the good life, but that it advances the wrong one. A liberalism that claims to overcome fear may thus, paradoxically, become a source of cultural estrangement or even of fear itself. Traditionalist religious believers and communitarians receive unexpected support here, namely from the skeptic, who adds a further concern. Philosophers have debated the nature of the good life for millennia, and while it would be overstated to say that no progress has been made, the progress achieved gives little reason to expect ethical consensus anytime soon. As we have seen, however, even a liberalism that emphasizes negative liberty logically requires some distinction between what we are positively free to do or to become and what not. Yet this requirement does not entail a commitment to perfectionism. An alternative foundation for a distinctively liberal ethics can be found in Kantian contractualism, which grounds moral judgment not in substantive ideals of the good life, but in the principle of mutual justification among free or autonomous and equal individuals. T.M. Scannon's account offers a prominent example. He anchors moral justification in the principle that an action is wrong if it cannot be justified to others on grounds no one could reasonably reject. This shifts the focus from promoting particular conceptions of the good life to identifying principles that recognize individuals as free and equal moral agents, regardless of their personal ideals. It provides a framework that remains publicly justifiable under conditions of pluralism, preserving morality while avoiding the pitfalls of paternalism and moral hierarchy. In this way, contractualism sustains liberalism's core commitment to justification without presupposing agreement on the substance of the good life. Contractualism is ethically more restrictive than Rawls' idea of an overlapping consensus, which, as recent developments, I just named Trump, suggest may A, amount to little more than an empty set, and B, obviously fails to prevent liberal democracies from sliding into authoritarianism. A liberal ethic that cannot avert such a collapse falls short of the very standards we ought to expect from a moral foundation of liberalism. By contrast, contractualism connects liberalism with its original normative foundations, which are individual autonomy and moral universalism, offering not just procedural legitimacy, but substantive moral content. In doing so, it restores an intrinsic link between liberalism and the ethical commitments that historically defined it, the equal moral standing of persons and the demand that power be justified to those subject to it. Let me conclude by addressing Alan's proposal to ground liberalism in freedom from fear. In what has been said so far, I've already implicitly situated this conception of liberty within the framework of classical philosophical accounts, such as negative and positive liberty. I've also, extending on Matt's lead, criticized that invoking freedom from fear as a moral foundation may unintentionally reinforce the very exclusionary dynamics it aims to overcome, and thus become a source of cultural estrangement or even of fear itself. This is particularly problematic because it leaves it somewhat unclear whose fear is at stake and what kind of fear liberalism is ultimately meant to overcome. Citizens do not, in general, fear populism itself. Of course, there's fear of populism, but are not those who fear populism precisely the liberals we do not need to worry about? Rather, the attraction of populism lies in that people fear something else, loss of status, social recognition, and security. The uncomfortable truth is that what they fear are the very consequences of liberalism, perhaps even of freedom itself. What generates anxiety is not that anyone seeks to take away their values. It is not precisely the achievement of liberalism that nowadays no one must obey authority, that everyone is free to live according to their own convictions. The problem rather is that others do no longer share one's own values. Why is that a problem? Because what was once experienced as a natural order grounded in tradition or religion is now being contested by liberalism with two major consequences. First, its function of structuring meaning, identity, and social roles is disrupted by exposure to people who choose different lives. One is no longer securely embedded in a stable moral world, but is forced to define one's place amid pluralism, the task that is burdensome for many. Added to this is the liberal acceleration of opportunity. What the anywheres experience as possibility and self-realization appears to the somewheres as disorientation and overload. Second, in the traditional order, status came with position, by birth, role, or community standing. In liberalism, by contrast, status must be earned, negotiated, even performed. Populism offers a shortcut. It always finds someone beneath you so that everyone within the imagined community can feel affirmed and seen without having to compete on liberal terms. In this way, pluralism itself becomes the object of fear, not because it prohibits traditional ways of life, but because it dissolves their taken for granted social coherence. If liberalism is to respond meaningfully to the demand for recognition and rootedness, it must go beyond procedural neutrality without collapsing into perfectionist prescription. At the same time, it must reckon with the fact that the context of today's liberal crisis is shaped not by liberalism's failure, but by its very success, and is therefore fundamentally different from the conditions that gave rise to versions 1.0 through 3.0. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabine, for these nuanced reflections on Alan's thesis and book. Before we go into the discussion and include all of you, I want to give Alan the chance to react, first of all, to Sabine's points. So please, Alan.
First, I will unmute. Okay, as you can imagine, I have many, many things that I would say. I'm not familiar with all of the objections that Sabine has raised, although I've certainly read some of them in Matt Sleet's work, and of course I've replied to Sleet. But it's part, I think, on the whole, of a larger group of objections on the part of people who often wants to suggest that we don't actually need liberalism 4.0. The 3.0 will do just fine in some sense. Now, Sabine is not doing that. I agree, right? She's saying that there are serious flaws here, but there's nevertheless a certain amount of overlap, which I'll get to between some of her objections and theirs. Two things very quickly. Sabine describes liberalism as an inherently progressive movement, not restorative. Historically, this is not entirely true, and perhaps something we can remember today, particularly in the context of Trump's America. Liberalism in the 19th century is continually oscillating between being the party of movement and the party of resistance. Which it is depends entirely on circumstances. The other is, I think, actually a German peculiarity here. I've had a number of people, uniquely Germans, come back to me with comments based on Gerald Gauss's work, which seems to be considered much more important in Germany than it is in the Anglo-Saxon world. And I'll give one reason why I think that it's not very important from my perspective. The quotation or the summary that Sabine made that Gauss defines liberalism as requiring all laws to be justified in some manner. Well, the Ayatollah Khomeini would say the same thing, right? All laws must be justified in relation to traditional religious concepts. Very few governments have dispensed without any form of legitimation. Montesquieu famously made the arguments that, in fact, all governments rest on public opinion. It's just that the public varies. So I think and nobody is exempt from justification. That's very different from what Mill was saying about the presumption of freedom. One of the problems here, and I admit it's a rhetorical problem that it's very hard to overcome, is the use of freedom by me as well as many people simultaneously in a strictly political sense and more generally in relation to economic freedom, religious freedom, covered by some concept of negative freedom, perhaps, also covered by a concept of positive freedom. One can find individual autonomy and fulfillment, for example, in engaging in entrepreneurship just as well as engaging in politics or prayer. This is a very large question, which I'm not going to attempt to address here. But so now I want to reject I think the heart of the matter, which, as I say in the last chapter, is a question that liberals have never really dealt with very well, and that is how we deal with the illiberal. Many of you are familiar with Popper's paradox. What happens when you give freedom to those who wish to take away your freedom? If you do this, you will end up having no freedom at all. He's thinking, of course, about Nazis and communists, but you will find a perfectly recognizable version of this in Pierre Bayle, writing in the 18th century, and he says, you give too much freedom to the Catholics, what's going to happen? They're going to wipe out the Protestants. Locke says the exact same thing in his letter on toleration. No, you can't tolerate Catholics. So how we deal with the illiberal and their feeling threatened by liberalism has been effectively a perennial problem for liberals. Who the illiberal are have changed, but our problem in dealing with them, that has not changed. And I don't think anybody has really worked out a fully acceptable or convincing solution to that problem. Um, Pure proceduralism, I think Sabina would agree, is not the solution to how we deal with the illiberal. I'm not convinced that Scanlon is really that much thicker than Rawls. I'd like to hear a lot more about how Kantian contractualism really adds to this relative. I mean, if we move to the Rawls of political liberalism rather than merely a theory of justice, you have a stub of a moral pillar, not nearly enough to support anything in my view, but I'm not sure if Scanlon really gives us much better than this. Now, my suggestion of perfectionism here has been rejected, I think because it's been um, misunderstood in a relatively uncharitable way. I'm certainly not suggesting that there is one concept of the good life we could ever agree on, right? Nobody could be so foolish as to suggest that. There are obviously many possible liberal concepts of a good life. Liberals can and should and will disagree about them, while urging other people, of course, to sign on to their particular points of view. So it's not just I'm saying, okay, well, let's replace an empty proceduralism with a fairly, a straitjacket of a particular kind of perfectionism. That clearly would be illiberal and it wouldn't work. Nor do I think we are ever going to abolish illiberalism. Um, Liberals got kind of confused, I think, by liberal success, first against Nazism and fascism, and then by winning the Cold War, into thinking that liberals can win victories by wiping out their enemies. That didn't work with religious fanatics, right? Religious fanaticism has never disappeared. All liberalism could do is limit its bad effects. Um, the same is true with all other forms of illiberalism. Liberalism can't destroy them. We may one day make it so there are no poor people, but there will always be illiberal people. What we have to do is find a way to protect liberalism from the illiberal as a permanent group with whom we are permanently in competition, which in itself is no bad thing. So I'm not suggesting that we are going to impose some kind of perfectionist view. When the illiberal person says to me, yes, okay, you have a conception of the good life, but it's the wrong conception of the good life. First of all, that enables us to engage in a far more mutually respectful debate than if we have none at all. We have, in fact, something to say to which they feel they have to make a response, as opposed to if, you're merely um, a completely amoral utilitarian Benthamite. And beyond this level of mutual respect, which is in itself important, of course, we are going to continue to disagree. And on some level here, as I said at some point in the book, of course, we wish to persuade these people. We cannot neutralize them. They are not going to disappear. But at another level, if they can't be persuaded, they have to be defeated. Not preferably with the pistol, right? So Isaiah Berlin was asked, so, how do you deal with negative freedom when your debate partner is Hitler? And he said the only way to deal with him is with a pistol. That's not the ideal solution, obviously. But at some level, it is, I'd like to put our resistance on a less radical part of the spectrum than, bloodshed. But at a certain point, yeah, resistance is the only means uh, rather than compromise. Okay, I'll stop there. There's lots of things there, I think, to talk about.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Sabina, if you want to clarify perhaps some of the
Yes,
reflections, please go ahead.
I would add. Well, first of all, a point where I strictly disagree. Trump's so-called liberalism is no liberalism. That's
Well,
the first thing.
I don't disagree with that at all. I
Okay,
completely
okay.
different though.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, of course, I agree that that Gaull's fundamental liberal principle is not that precise and that Mill is more precise. But still, I think the point that both have is that political liberalism is a theory about political legitimacy in the sense that no state or institution or whatever is allowed to disrespect their citizens' right for freedom, and that the burden of proof is always with those who want to restrict freedom. That's I think a very basic view, and this is of course also only a necessary, not yet a sufficient condition. Then Scanlon, I combine this with what you said about perfectionism. As I said in my comment, perfectionism is by design exclusionary. You must say this is a form of a good life, and this is not, and so you're devaluing certain forms of life. But what you now said. You said that you are going to allow for a broad range of all permissible ways of good life. And this sounds a lot what I mean by contractualism. So where we agree, Alan, is first of all, liberalism is comprehensive. It requires a liberal ethics or morality. I understood you that you are going for a kind of perfectionism. Now I understand you that you allow for a broad range of permissible ways of good life. But then the question, of course, is how do we define that permission? And there my suggestion would be we need some principles. And it was just a suggestion to refer to Scanlon. I think Scanlon is thicker than Rawls because it's a comprehensive moral theory which he proposes. I cannot explain this in detail here. And so we seem to agree on more than I expected. Yeah, and I think I will stop here. Okay.
I would add just one more thing. I agree it's not entirely satisfactory, but one philosopher who suggests means of distinguishing between the range of acceptable perfectionisms and the range of unacceptable ones is Joseph Raz.
Yes, but Joseph Raz is a perfectionist.
Yes, yes, and so indeed am I. That is to say, I admit in this range of liberal perfectionisms, which are exclusionary both of each other and of illiberal perfectionisms, we can attempt to make a distinction between that which is a liberal form of life, and we can argue in many ways. We will never agree about just what exactly is the good life, but that there are some notions of the good life, perhaps that held by various fundamentalist religious groups, which we will agree are in fact excluded from the range of liberal perfectionisms, and we have to deal with. I'm going to add one other thing on the moral front here, because it's not in the book, but is some of the kinds of things that I'm thinking about now, and that is to say, the kinds of moral discourse that we don't engage in. So in the 19th century, one of the fancy literary ways of referring to homosexuality in English was the love that dare not say its name. Well, we're happy to talk about homosexuality now, but now we have the vice or the sin which no one dare name, and that is envy. And one of the things liberals need to do in a new moral discourse is start denouncing envy just as often as the illiberal denounce greed. And I'll stop.
Okay, okay. So that then just one final remark about Scanlon and Rawls. I think, well, Scanlon doesn't restrict himself, unlike Rawls, to a contingent overlapping consensus. This is really a normative account, and he excludes practices which are anti-pluralistic. Yeah, that's one thing. And I think another question is when we talk about perfectionism, is this kind of ethics part of political liberalism? And my assumption would be it would be a promising way to have a contractualist liberal ethics, whereas I'm very skeptical about a political a perfectionist liberal ethics, because I think this is not, and here I'm a Rawlsian, this is not the task of political liberalism. This does not mean that we cannot lead different ways of life or even advertise them and try to convince others. But the question is, where are the limits of political liberalism here? So, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for those inputs, and I think there's much to think about and many points you raised. I will now give the chance to the audience to come in and to discuss with both of you. I've already seen a lot of signs, and this is going to be the general rule. Please use the function raise your hand so I can note you down. And first of all, I want to give the word to Niels Carlsen. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you both for a very interesting discussion, and it ties very much into the kind of work I'm doing right now. So I very much agree with the need to have a more moral dimension into value-oriented dimension taken into account when we discuss liberalism. But my question was triggered by the discussion about perfectionism, and it ties very much into Sabine's last question. So to me, it would be hard to accept a perfectionist state. And the fact is that that's exactly what we've seen over the last decades with the welfare state. It has been very paternalistic in many ways. That tries to influence the way we live our lives, from a very distinct view of what a good life entails. So my question to you, Alan, what's the role of the state in this construct of yours? I mean, I very much are in favor of a non-perfectionist civil society, markets, and so on. We may have very strong opinions about how not only ourselves should live our good lives, but how others should live their lives. And we can argue, we can make opinion about them. We could have different churches, religions, debating it. But when it comes to the role of the state, I mean, even though the state cannot be fully neutral, it has to, of course, uphold liberty and democratic open society in various ways, but it should be as neutral as possible. So what's the role of the state in your construct here?
Two potential answers to that. One of the short answers is the role of the state is to guarantee everyone's right to exit, in Hirschman's sense. That is to say, people need to have an opportunity to leave various kinds of community guaranteed to them by the state. Let me give you a very specific kind of example of how this would change, for example, American law and practice at the moment. In 1962, a group of Amish, that is to say, very religious Mennonites, filed suit against the state of Wisconsin, which insisted that they educate their children past the age of 12. Note, the Amish were not contending for a right to homeschooling. They were contending for a right to the end of any form of formal education after 12. And the Supreme Court said this was part of their religious rights, and the state of Wisconsin could not insist on that. That might even have been a correct decision in 1962, when we could actually imagine, with the 12th grade, age 12 education, getting a job and earning a living. Today, you can't imagine that. Therefore, those Amish children uneducated after the age of 12 are being denied effectively any right to exit that community. The state needs to guarantee it. The state should require the Amish to educate those children at least to the age of 16 and perhaps to the age of 18, whether or not the Amish like it. Because otherwise, this is the same as simply saying you can tie your kids up to a chair and not let them leave for all practical purposes. So in this sense, the opportunity of perfection in a different way, the right of exit from any different community needs to be, I think, guaranteed by the state. That I think is the relatively easier answer, the state role in guaranteeing exit and therefore guaranteeing, in a sense, a negative kind of freedom in a positive sense, but in one in which, in the modern circumstances, has to be guaranteed by the state against various groups. You can apply this just as much in its own way to female circumcision as you can to requiring education. The other, which would certainly be more controversial, but which, interestingly enough, is also acknowledged by Milton Friedman, um, who, of course, as you know, is mostly against any form of public education, but in an oft overlooked paragraph in Freedom to Choose says, I might have thought differently about this if this was the United States in 1910 and we have a really, really large immigrant population, which we need to introduce to some level of liberal common value in a required curriculum, not necessarily given in a state school, but required by the state. And here too, one can imagine some kind of, further extension of my notion of a right to exit here in some level of common curriculum that provides people at, with a certain kind of choice and enforces or at least suggests the possibility of a certain kind of mutual respect where that's going to be inculcated in your children, even if people don't wear the right kind of clothes or have the wrong kind of sexuality, etc. Now, I'm certainly not arguing that the state ought to be telling us about our necessarily egalitarian relationships to whatever.
So what is your perfectionism then? It seems to be very little left.
My perfectionism in terms of what the state is going to do is going to be, in fact, not very big. But my perfection, but my perfectionism in terms of what Milton Friedman does not do is a great deal. If you simply tell people freedom, you're free to choose, and I have nothing to say about what your choice is going to be.
I agree completely.
Yeah, then you lose. All right. But I certainly do not want the state beyond this relatively minimal level, which is more than, for example, the American state does with the Amish right now.
But we as liberals should not refrain from having strong views about the good life.
Yes, and even associating them with our liberalism.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Ismail Kurun is the next on my list. Please, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ellen and Sabine. This was a fascinating discussion. I have two questions which are somewhat like commentary, but I will try to put them into the form of questions. The first is, there is this Michael Walzer argument that liberalism has become essentially an adjective rather than a noun. The argument is because now we use terms like liberal conservative or liberal Christian, even liberal socialist, it seems like liberalism has become almost synonymous with the word decent. What do you think about this? Are we facing a situation where liberalism has become just expanded in terms of political morality, so that it has become just undistinct from the earlier versions of liberalism? That's the first. The second is, I don't think Locke was not influential in the 19th century. It seems to me that his ideas have become so fundamental has become the bedrock of classical liberalism that people just don't need to mention him anymore. So it seems like Locke's influence was indirect, but his ideas were so embedded into the 19th century liberalism that people just didn't reference them anymore. And I think a good analogy is that Bertrand Russell, at least in the US, has not been read at philosophy departments, which is pretty weird because he was one of the founding figures of analytic philosophy, and now students just don't. He's not in the syllabi. So, but his ideas in terms of founding the analytic tradition have become so fundamental that people just assume them. And I also show in my own book, The Theological Origins of Liberalism, that Locke's ideas were just assumed in the foundation of the United States government, as well as especially the Constitution of Carolina.
Sure.
So, and just another example, and then I'll end. I think we should make a distinction between distinctive thinkers and foundational thinkers. Schopenhauer, for example, is a very distinctive thinker. I think he will be read for many, many, many years just because of the interestingness and distinctiveness of his ideas. Locke is not that distinctive in that sense. His ideas are just foundational, but not that distinctive. So do you think that that's a better perspective on Locke rather than saying that Locke was not influential in the 19th century? Thank you.
Okay, I'll answer those in reverse order. So look, we have lots of very explicit dismissal of Locke as a political thinker in the 19th century. The one thing that John Stuart Mill and Leslie Stephen agree on is they both say that Locke's ideas about politics are simply too old, too confused, not relevant to us. If you look, and here again, I'm borrowing other people's research. If you look at the textbooks of political theory used in the United States and Britain in the 19th century, frequently they simply leave Locke out. And when they do bring him in, for example, Sabine's textbook, he says Locke is a thinker who's basically medieval in orientation and has nothing to do with the development of liberalism. The standard line is that liberalism is the creation of the industrial and political revolutions of the 18th century. The problem with Locke is not that they consider him wrong, it's they just don't think the 17th century really matters anymore. The 19th century is a period of enormous historical consciousness and of consciousness of historical change. And simply Locke is back there, and it really doesn't make a whole lot of difference. And even in the American sense, right? This goes back to Donald Lutz's amazing work in 1980 before you had Google Ngram and so on. When you look to references to Locke in the American Revolution, right? They're enormous through about 1778. So certainly, contrary to Gary Wills and so on, Locke is terribly important for the writing of the Declaration of Independence and so on and so forth. But after 1778, people stopped talking about him simply because you needed Locke to justify revolting against an established government. When you're writing a constitution, look in the Federalist Papers. Locke doesn't play much of a role. Okay, the other question is the one that I'll pay you for later, right? I love that question. Walter gets it, as so often, precisely backwards. But in this case, in a certain sense, he's right. We keep talking about liberal democracy. It's an adjective. The important thing is always the noun, or at least the more important thing is the noun. This is why my next book is going to be called Democratic Liberalism. Because liberalism is actually more important than democracy. And for me, democracy, as for much of the history of liberalism, would have been considered a truism. Democracy is simply a useful tool to get us liberalism. And where it doesn't, liberals have no interest in it.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, absolutely. This is an important point, and that's what the next book is about.
Mm-hmm.
Sabine, do you want to join
I agree. I agree with your answer on this on the first question. It was, in fact, and I also like this question a lot. But I think it has also to do, apart from these hyphen liberalisms, it also has to do with the fact that the very notion of liberty, of freedom, is used by completely different political movements. Communists, anarchists, everybody believes that he has the key to freedom. And in philosophy, it turns out that it's very hard to analyze the concept of liberty, and that there are at least 5 different concepts of liberty. I only mentioned 2 today. I forgot, for example, about Republican liberty, and also we have a difference between how we talk in Germany about liberalism and how the word liberalism is used in the United States. Because in Germany, we very often talk about liberalism when we somehow mean economics, and it's strongly related to these ideas, whereas in the States you have roles, and there is in a way a break from an old to a new liberalism, where it's no longer even clear whether we need whether private property has anything to do with liberalism. So the term is very broadly used. Well, and sometimes, yes, I agree, just to say liberal democracy, even though we would first have to explain whether the relationship between liberalism and democracy is merely instrumental, or whether it's constitutive.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Very briefly, there's 5 pages in the book about how the word liberal got its current meaning in the United States as compared to Europe. So if you want to know, you can find out. And oh yes, one of the things I contend very, very briefly in the book is that republicanism, anytime after the 17th century, is essentially not distinguishable from liberalism, despite the best efforts of Quentin Skinner.
All right. Thank you very much. Next on the list is Professor Wegner, please.
Okay, thank you, Alan. At first, my apology that I have not yet found the opportunity to read your book. We started the discussion some weeks ago in Berlin, and your presentation in Berlin, but also now, is very thoughtful. I have one question. What do you think about the following alternative definition of liberalism, which may overlap with yours, but is not identical with it? And this definition is inspired by John Stuart Mill, whom you mentioned a lot. Liberalism is a kind of political reflection about the shortcomings and deficiencies of a society which already has established freedom rights, or at least many freedom rights. So it's a style of thinking, of reflection about the deficiencies of a society. This acknowledges, and this is this is Mill's way of dealing with his own English society. He is fully aware that this is a society which has many shortcomings and deficiencies, which has poverty, which has inequality as to wealth, inequality as to education, and he discusses how one can overcome these deficiencies in a way which still acknowledges that the basic freedom rights have to be respected and cannot be removed. So, and this is also an appeal to tolerance. So Mill also deals with new political movements such as socialism, which he discusses very carefully. In the end, he rejected this, but he discusses very carefully. So such a definition would integrate ethics, because it's the ethics of public discourse. It will also integrate free markets. It's a way where Mill is very aware of the operating conditions of a market society, which he wants to improve but not to remove. Yes, and it has a political dimension. Of course, Mill was not in the situation that his English society was challenged by enemies of freedom. This was not his historical situation. There were also workers' riots, and as Christopher Clark wrote in his book, Spring of Revolution, he mentioned that especially the English state used a lot of violence against demonstrating workers. So it was also well, establishing its or securing its stability by using violence, which is mostly neglected. Christopher Clark mentioned this. So, but this is a way. This would be what do you think about this definition?
Okay. I would have a whole lot to say about Mill on socialism. I think he's been grossly misread by a lot of the recent left-wing interpretations of the stationary state and so on, but this would take us way out of our discussion for the moment. I think that, as you say, Mill's definition there was very much time-bound, and that he was living in a society in which, at least for most practical purposes, there was far more of a liberal consensus than there is today. And that this conception of liberalism simply being a attitude of critical principles towards a society in which basic freedoms are already guaranteed, which I grant you is there in On Liberty in many ways. This is clearly a doctrine that, as Abraham Lincoln would put it, is inadequate to the stormy present. And I think Mill himself would end up saying something like that. So I don't see it as, it's certainly different from my definition. I think in some ways it's an emanation of mine, that he's talking about, okay, so we've got certain freedom rights, but women are denied the vast majority of them. So we need to free them from fear by giving them rights and so on and so forth. So it's different. I would regard it as a small subset of what I'm talking about, and very much attached to the conditions of mid-19th century Europe, but especially England.
Thank you, Alan. Next I have on the list is Lars Peter. Please pose your question.
Yes. Thank you so much, both of you, for interesting introductions. And I have two quite specific questions to primarily Alan, I suppose, but Sabine is welcome to join that kind of answering it. And both questions are really based on the supposition that we are not pursuing any kind of perfectionism. The first question is freedom. Is freedom simply a value among, or the preferred value in terms of liberalism, as any in comparison with any other, in the same way as any other kind of values? Or is it actually more meaningful to think about freedom as the mother of all values? So, and does that make any difference to the foundation of liberal thought? And the other question is, and this is a statement that I maybe interpreted to be somewhat Dahrendorfian, and that is, and with Dahrendorf, I think that any kind of future liberalism with the future does need to have a specific conception about what liberal progress really is in society. So my challenge then would be, do you have what would be your interpretation of liberal progress?
Once again, I will start with the second question because to me it's easier. Liberal progress has been over history freeing more and more people from more and more fears, right? Women have less reason now to be afraid of men than they did 100 years ago. That's progress from a liberal perspective. Black people have less reason to be afraid of white people now than they did, at least let's say in the United States, even 60 or 70 years ago. Homosexuals have less reason to be afraid than they did in an even more recent past. All of these are examples of liberal progress. And indeed, one can put this in other terms as well. Thanks to liberal market economies, fewer people face severe poverty throughout the globe today than 50 years ago. All of this is liberal progress that we can point to in terms of freedom from fear. And I think it's not too hard to do. The other question, freedom as a value. Well, let me go to my definition. Liberalism is the search for a society in which no one need be afraid. The word freedom does not appear in that definition. But one of the things I do in the first pages of the book is say Montesquieu defines freedom as the opinion each person has of their own security. That is to say, their freedom from fear, in my terms. And so once we've understood freedom in that sense, freedom is indeed the value of liberalism because freedom represents our freedom from fear. Oddly enough, the title of the book. Liberalism represents our freedom from fear. So there you go.
Sabine, do you want to comment on that, especially the question of freedom, perhaps?
Yes,
Please.
I mean, well, in my view, what distinguishes liberalism from other political position is precisely that it regards freedom or liberty as the fundamental political value. But then the question is, what do we mean by freedom? I think that I'm here I here take side with Gerald McCallum that we have at least three variables. We always ask freedom from what? Freedom from interference and so on, and freedom to what? And then a very important question is whose freedom is meant. And I think that liberalism of today, in the tradition of the Enlightenment, is always universal. So that's an important thing. And when you ask me about liberal progress, then I think that we need institutions that allow pluralism and that I'm not afraid to lead my own way of life is, so to speak, a collateral use of institutions which function that way. So we need sort of Republican liberty conception, which might guarantee that. But yeah, not on the sense of so much of Skinner, but more of Pettit. Yeah.
Thank you, Sabine. Next I have on the list is Erwin Decker, please.
Yeah, thank you, Alan, and others for the great discussion. I felt that Sabine's final question to me was the most interesting in her comments, namely the one of why populism is just not a form of fear and why a liberalism anti-fear would not have to sort of accommodate a lot of the, or seek to accommodate a lot of the fears that it expresses. But even if I take the populist out, I would worry that a lot of liberal history shows that if we are too fearful or if we take fear too seriously, we are in danger of corrupting the liberal program. So this was true very clearly at the end of the 19th century when liberals feared revolution and therefore often turned toward conservatives and formed alliances with conservatives. This was true during the McCarthy era. When liberals feared communism so much that they essentially turned the state into a kind of monster that squashed pluralism in society. So this whole anti-fear conception of liberalism seems to me to be overreaching in all sorts of ways, in which I actually think liberalism's main reason for existing is worrying that we might overdo stuff. And a liberalism of fear seems to be in constant danger of overdoing things.
The short answer is yes. Liberals are always tempted to become illiberal in different kinds of ways. So, for example, there is what in the book I call the Hegelian temptation of liberalism in general, I contend, sees salvation politically, economically, religiously, always as coming from civil society, never as coming from the state. But there's a great temptation, for example, when you are fighting poverty, to decide that, well, actually, salvation really can come from the state. And we can, in fact, eliminate poverty by concentrating all the economic power, the distribution of income, et cetera, in state hands. So there's a temptation for liberals to fall off the wagon and become socialists. And we see this happen with a lot of liberals in both Europe and the United States, anywhere between especially 1900 and the Second World War. On the other hand, when we are frightened of revolution, one thing liberals do is say, okay, we need constitutions. We probably all agree that's a good liberal thing for them to do, to try to prevent revolutions and prevent, despotism from the reaction as well. But in any given moment, when liberals are in the middle of what they think is a life and death crisis, to abandon liberalism and to endorse, on the one hand, Bismarck or McCarthy, as you say. So yes, liberals are always faced with this kind of temptation. Um, um, my friend Aurelian Kraiutu will say this is why moderation is an essentially liberal virtue and is necessary to prevent us from doing this kind of thing. But indeed, as the saying goes, fear is a bad counselor. And when you get too afraid, it's easy for liberals to go too far. But by bearing in mind the general principle that we want no one to be afraid, I think this helps us from going too far and saying, well, it's okay if the rich get afraid of confiscatory taxes if we need them to free some poor people from the fear of poverty, and it's okay if some people who we will call communists in the McCarthy era fear afraid to express their opinions because otherwise we'll end up having Stalin in America. So I think bearing in mind this central principle of liberalism, which is that it is for everyone and that there are no exceptions, we can avoid that. And one other thing I will add to this is sparked by a comment Sabina made when she said it's terribly important who is afraid. That's one of the things that I talk about in the introduction of the book. And sometimes, too often in the late 20th century, we think only about individuals, that people are afraid because of their individual actions or non-actions. But liberalism traditionally is not just worried about the fears of individuals, but also about the fears of groups. For example, at the very beginning here, proto-liberals, they're not worried about just you feeling that as a individual, your religious convictions may get you burned at the stake, but that you as a church, as a community, have a right not to be afraid, be able to practice as a community, as a group, so that the fears we have to take into account and the people we have to avoid trampling on are not just individuals, but also groups.
All right, then Niklas Berggren, please go ahead.
Okay, I have two questions. I guess one as an economist and one as an amateur philosopher. The first economist comment is, I'm always a little worried. I'm very intrigued by Alan's idea of this notion of fear and its role in liberalism. It's, to me, a very creative and novel type of framing of liberalism or of understanding liberalism. But the economist side of me worries when somebody pushes for one goal. We should aim at this one goal. We haven't reached it yet, but we shall push forward and nobody should be afraid of anything. Aren't there always trade-offs? I'm always afraid of corner solutions. There are other values than avoiding fear. Sometimes we need some fear in a dynamic society. So I'm wondering, sort of, aren't there any countervailing values that can make us genuinely want not to reach a perfect state of nobody being afraid, because it brings with it certain downsides. My amateur philosopher question is about fear, and I'm wondering, what is fear and what is its, should we say, moral status? I'm thinking a little bit, somebody mentioned it here, the discussion about harm, that concept in Mill's thought. And there is this discussion, is it an objective concept? Who experiences harm? Probably not. And Sabine touched on it also. Fear, the same thing. And when you discussed the justified criticism, Alan, um, you seemed quite rapidly to dismiss certain types of fear of the liberal society or in the liberal society. I'm thinking of Buchanan's piece, Afraid to be Free, Dependency as Desideratum, where he says that people actually don't want freedom because you have to be responsible in society. And that is a kind of fear, or as Eric Hoffer called it, an irksome burden, especially for people who lack positive freedom or ways of using negative freedom. They may not want it, they may fear it, they may feel tramped on, lose social status, and so on. So, is this an objective? How can you define which kinds of fear one should take into account? Can it, yeah. Again, I'm an amateur philosopher, so I hope that second question got through in some way. Yeah, sorry for being a bit long.
That's okay. I too am an amateur philosopher, right? By training, I'm a historian. By practice, I've become a political theorist. But as Sabina will be the first to tell you, historians and political theorists are a little bit different from philosophers. And this shows up in my work in various ways. But let me start with your questions for a change in order. So that first one about the danger of liberals pursuing a single goal. So Isaiah Berlin, would call this monism. And this would then, and monism is a bad thing. It is illiberal. We need to be pluralist. And am I not therefore turning liberalism into a monism? Well, fear is a sufficiently manifold concept that I think the answer is no. It isn't actually monism. Um, we were talking earlier only in terms of perfectionism, but as I make quite clear in the book, I don't claim that all liberals have been perfectionists or that they all should be perfectionists. Utilitarianism is also very strong in liberal history. And in fact, in the 19th century, illogical and unphilosophical though this is, many leading liberals are utilitarians on page 1 and perfectionists on page 5. And on page 8, they're utilitarians again. And if you want an example of this, Macaulay is perfect. And in fact, quite commonplace. And I think this sort of willingness to accept what is in the abstract a contradiction is what saves liberalism from monism as in fact the classic liberal solution. Let us have our cake and eat it too. Is an excellent liberal position in terms of many different kinds of things. That's what we're trying to do in all kinds of ways. Now, fear of responsibility. I think that's a really important point. One of my objections has always been when I hear the argument made that, we want a society of free and responsible people. Well, good luck with that, because most people don't want to be responsible. And if you link freedom to responsibility, guess what's going to lose? Freedom, precisely because we don't want responsibility. On the other hand, the secret weapon of liberalism is that nobody wants to be afraid. Nobody wants to be dragged out of their bed and tortured for reasons they may or may not be aware of or may or may not be able to be changed to change. For example, I can't change the fact that I have the wrong skin color and I happen to be wandering into the wrong place in the American South, and so on and so forth. You can imagine other versions of this. So this is why, in fact, I think the notion of fear is superior to a notion of responsibility, precisely because Lots of people don't want to be responsible. In fact, most people probably don't want to be responsible and never will. Education is never going to solve our problems here or anywhere else. Um, but nobody wants to be afraid.
Yes, please, Sabine, join us.
Yes, I mean, the first question, I'm afraid I did too often philosophy of economics. Yes, I see your point. I mean, the question is whether fear is the only value or whether there need to be trade-offs with other values. And my question would exactly be, Alan, you just said, no, I'm not committed to monism, but it's difficult. I mean, if you say that the absence of fear or freedom from fear is the dominant value, doesn't this mean that in the end, if you combine this with perfectionism, the best life has to be that which best achieves this goal, rather than, allowing for trade-offs with other values? So, and then a second point, and it comes to your second point. Yes, I mean, I think that it was my last comment. That many today fear not populism, but the consequences of liberalism, because they are afraid because what was once experienced as a natural order, which was grounded in traditional religion, is now being contested by liberalism, and so the social coherence is no longer there, and that's not the fear of populism. The people who adhere to populism, they have a different kind of fears. They are afraid of losing their social status and so on. And so yes, I think that's a different kind of fear. And if we try to formulate liberalism in terms of freedom from fear, we need to distinguish between different kind of fears, and we also need to do some work on which fears are appropriate and which are not.
Let me respond to that a bit. For the last part, of course, I agree, right? This history is incomplete. I'm perfectly happy for other people to take up the task of working on differentiating different kinds of fears, appropriate kinds of fears, in the sense of competition, other points of view, etc. But on a previous point, look, one of the things I say repeatedly in the last chapter is that fear of liberalism has created populism in many ways. Fear of globalization associated with liberalism has led to people becoming populists. In the Tocquevillian sense, it's in many respects fear of democratic society and its further development, in a sense of equality that creates populism, insofar as you're afraid of the challenge, to traditional gender roles. You're afraid of the challenge traditional hierarchies, et cetera, et cetera. All these things that Tocqueville thinks are part and parcel of a democratic society create fears. And what it creates, but what populism is it's the opposite of what Rawls wanted. Rawls wanted an overlapping liberal consensus. And what I say in the book is what we've got is an overlapping illiberal consensus.
Yeah.
People who often quite disagree with each other, right? Radical nationalists and traditional religion aren't the same thing. But they come together in their rejection of liberalism. And a good all-round word for this, good label, is populism, because this is the label these people use for themselves when they form their own illiberal overlapping coalition. And this is what, therefore, we are confronted of. And as each of us individually says, oh, we've got to overcome fear of globalization, we have to overcome fear of pluralism, we have to overcome, et cetera, et cetera. This is what we're talking about. So essentially, I agree on that point. I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. So next on the list, I have Lars Nate. I don't know if you still want to have raised your hand, but
Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right.
Thank
Go ahead.
you. So I have two questions for Alan Kane. Thank you very much. So I haven't read the book, so I'm sorry if you address these points in your book. So the first one is about the three pillars and how they interact, because from philosophical point of view, you might think, arguments in favor of markets and arguments in favor of political liberty, they are sort of moral arguments. So that it's sort of unclear how, or I would say that the justification of markets and the justification of political liberty is sort of moral justification. So how is it that sort of morality is a separate pillar? And I guess my interpretation of what you could mean by that is that it's something like an ethos, like a sort of personal ethos. I'm not sure if that captures what you mean. And then I guess with regards to the idea that people like Milton Friedman did not stress this enough. I mean, there is this text where he argues that, I mean, on the social responsibility of business to increase its profits. He does say in the end this kind of famous quote that, businesses ought to, like the social responsibility of businesses is to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. So I wonder if that sort of captures something like the kind of ethos that you think is nonetheless necessary, or if that's maybe too thin. Right, and then the second question is about who should be afraid or who should not be afraid. And it kind of links back to something you just said about being afraid because of something you cannot change. So I would imagine that in a perfectly liberal society, some people should still be afraid, for example, criminals, like violent criminals or people who want to rip off other people and so on. And one way to capture that would be to say, well, it's your fault that you're a criminal, you can change it. But then I don't know if that really works, because you also say that, for example, socialism or communism is illiberal because it wants rich people to be afraid, but you can stop being a rich person also. So I don't know how you can sort of capture this without you know what I mean, like sort of how you work out the So what's the idea there? Thank you.
Okay, I'll take those in order too. So, I mean, it's certainly possible to collapse all political arguments and all economic arguments into moral arguments. I would suggest that economists and political theorists would suggest that was a bad idea. That in fact these disciplines do have some autonomy, and not everything we do is simply an exercise of our morality. Although if you want to translate things into moral terms, you can, but just to give you an example of this kind of thing, we've been using the word moral, we've been avoiding using the word very late 20th century of us, the word religious of us in this discussion. So from many liberal religious perspectives, you must in fact freely choose your faith in order to get to heaven, whereas your economic behavior is not about going to heaven. Max Weber notwithstanding. And he's probably wrong about that anyway. So yeah, there is a difference here in the kinds of things we're trying to get out of liberalism, the kinds of things that freedom from fear buys us in the political, economic, and moral/religious realms are, I think it buys us rather different kinds of things, all necessary to get if we're going to have something like a stable liberal society. And I think your quotation from Milton Friedman is exactly the kind of really thin notion of morality that I'm saying, look, it's just simply inadequate. And when you say these kinds of things, people revolt against that. And I'm sorry, the second question seems to have escaped my note taking here.
It was about how you can capture sort of the freedom of
the criminals. Yes, right.
Yeah,
okay.
exactly.
So yes, as I say in the book, yes, certain kinds of people are supposed to be afraid. We want murderers to be afraid of the law, ideally afraid enough that they don't commit murder. Right? That we're afraid of retribution to the extent that we're rational creatures. Maybe this will stop us from doing bad things. And look, I'll fall back on being a historian rather than a philosopher. Clearly, there's some fuzzy lines here that I think could be worked out. If one wanted to try it, please do. It's an incomplete history. As to, okay, we want the murderers to be afraid. We don't want to prevent competition, not just economic, but competition in terms of views of what a good life is and so on and so forth, competition in views of how you get your soul saved, how you go to heaven, and so on, or nirvana, wherever your preferred destination is. And these things will give people maybe cause to worry rather than cause to fear. Trying to create some kind of definition between, as I said, in the case of, the runner and the race. Yeah, I don't want to lose. Yes, I may be in some sense afraid of losing, and that fear can be good because it spurs me to train harder, run harder, be a better runner, be a better person in some other sense. And I think we can draw distinctions in this sense that are at least good enough for government work, as they sometimes say. That in most cases, we know which is one and which is the other. Criminal, be afraid. Choice of religious faith, don't be afraid.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Karen, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for this fascinating discussion, which I'm really happy to have. I have sort of a last remark to Alan and then two questions for Sabine. I think Alan has been triggered enough on the topic of what kind of fear we should avoid and which is legitimate that he might end up writing a book about that, which would be lovely. My remark is just that there's this whole debate on the definition of the appropriate notion of fear reminds me of the debate about what kind of coercion is really coercion. What the contrary of liberty means. Is coercion only something where you're threatened in your life and body, or is it something that has to do with your with a way of how you can lead a prosperous and happy life? Or these where you draw the line is essential, and we've seen people like Hayek and others struggling with it, and I think maybe you have the same quandary with fear here. My questions to Sabine are actually two. I think I said that. The first is from an analytical point of view. I understand this focus on political liberalism that should not come with a perfectionist ideal in the background. But what does that mean for the individual, for the human being that says in politics, I think political liberalism is a good idea, but I'm more than just a political person. I'm also a person that wants to have a guideline in life and an ethos, and I want to discuss an ethos with other people. These things interact after all, right? Our norms evolve through interaction as we talk about our values. And is it possible to compartmentalize liberalism in this way that we say in the political field, I want the state to abstain from coming with any kind of ideal about people's ethos, but as a person and as a member of society, I do have an ideal about the perfect or the good life and about a good ethos, and shouldn't I try to foster this notion and debate it? The question is really how does an ethos come into being? How does it change over time? And how doesn't it evolve in the way how Adam Smith saw it as a function of constant interaction? That's question number one. Question number two is just, you mentioned this Scanlon thesis about, well, it's actually a measuring rod, saying that the better question might be to ask what the mutual justification between free and equal individuals would look like. And I'd be just interested, apart from the analytical definition, what this could look like in practice.
Sabine, you're muted at the moment, so can't hear you.
But I'm not sure whether Alan is not first in any case. I mean,
I don't care. My answer is probably going to be shorter than yours, so maybe I should start there. I very much like that comparison with, how we're going to define coercion versus fear, because in particular, for example, some people have argued that any form of persuasion constitutes coercion. And so Rousseau took this to an extreme, right? So we should, not actually discuss with any other human being before we cast our votes, because this would mean coercion. In a more sensible way, John Adams said, look, pick any random 100 people from the street, and 25 will immediately become aristocrats. What's an aristocrat? Somebody whose opinion determines somebody else's, regardless of the merits. It can be because they're smarter, better speakers, wealthier, prettier, more famous. Saw them on TV last week. We can't get rid of this kind of coercion. In this same sense, there are certain kinds of, fears like death and spiders that we can't get rid of, and maybe also competition. But as with coercion, I mean, there's an old saying, hard cases make bad law. I'm not that interested in getting to the last degree of preciseness about this. I think it's good enough to work for my purposes, for our purposes from a liberal perspective, which is why, no, I'm not going to write another book about fear. The other book is about democratic liberalism.
Okay, well, thank you for both of your questions, Karen. They are great questions. What I was trying to say was that the contractualist allows, of course, private perfectionism. You can even advertise your way of life or the way you think a good life should look like to others. But the point is that what makes you a liberal is that you celebrate when others come up with different with different conceptions of the good life, and that you tolerate these different conceptions of life up to a certain point. And this is why I thought that contractualism might help, because it is linked to basic ideas of liberalism since the Enlightenment means the autonomous and equal persons and universalism. And so, you ask, how does this look in practice? I think that in Scanlon, but also already in Kant, there is a simple idea, which means everybody is free to live as he likes. But what we must exclude is that I allow something for me which I would not allow others, so that you and then you try to find a way to find a principle. And this principle is really more like, or it's like the constitution or the basic law in Germany, or the rule of law. So what Scanlon suggests, that we need when it becomes difficult, that we have to weigh whether my plan could be reasonably rejected by someone else. So I don't think that that my life is split. No, but I think there is a certain domain which is the domain of politics, and what I entirely what I would find Bad would be the idea that the state has any influence in prescribing how we ought to live. Yeah, I mean, this is, for instance, a tension in John Stuart Mill. I mean, John Stuart Mill, he says, "Oh, the state should not interact," but on the other hand, he differentiates between higher and lower pleasures, and so then in the end, when it comes to vote, he makes a difference. So this is a tension we should avoid. So yeah. But I don't feel that as a liberal, I therefore become schizophrenic in a way. But that what makes me a liberal is also tolerance.
Thank you, Sabine. I think we have time for one last question. Professor Kukatas, please.
Thank you. And hi, Alan. Good to see you. So I have a very general question, which is who are you, or who have you written this book for? And the reason I ask this is obviously there are lots of books out there about liberalism. I've added to the pile myself, and there are more definitions of liberalism than one would care to admit. How would you characterize your own intervention? I thought it was a marvelous book, so it's not a critical question, but looking for really a little bit more insight into what it is that you are hoping that this intervention will achieve, and a part of that means asking you, who is the audience, other than the general public and everyone you want to buy the book.
Ah, yes, the mythical educated public. Thank you for that question and those remarks. Essentially, the book had two purposes. One related to my past, one related to my future, right? Part of it is, let's say, a historical argument and a set of historical arguments about liberalism. One of the criticism I expected to get and have been rather surprised that I have not gotten is people pushing back against my periodization and my general characterization of those periods. I've been surprised that more people did not raise disagreements because those are not necessarily the standard periodizations in the literature. And I've gotten a little bit of pushback on readings of individual thinkers, but again, not nearly as much as I expected. So it's a set of historical arguments, both in terms of these dominant fears, these dominant issues, the relationship of liberals to very particular kinds of issues, whether they be imperialism or feminism or the suffrage, which are also discussed as well as individual thinkers in the book. So one audience has been historians, and has always been the case in my work, an implicit argument about this as saying, look, there is such a thing as liberalism, or even if you prefer Western liberalism, that it's a historically coherent thing that one can point to. And here's the way it develops, and here's my historical argument or set of arguments about it. That's one audience for the book. The second audience of the book, and it perhaps may be the larger audience, in fact, although I didn't expect this to be, is in fact political theorists, all those people who are concerned with populism, all those people who only read the last chapter of the book, essentially, which is titled Liberalism and Populism. And here, the argument, in one sense, goes well beyond what I have to say about, three pillars and perfectionism and utilitarianism and all that, simply to say, and this accords with a comment that somebody else made that I didn't have a chance to address, the very strong conviction on my part, I think well-grounded conviction, that we need something new. One of the things that I have recognized in reading a lot of the political theory literature having to do with various aspects of liberalism over the past 20 years is that most of these people have no idea how unoriginal they are and how their book is a small footnote to John Stuart Mill on representative government. And this will not do. That we are faced with a new situation, we are faced with a very different social world, a very different set of political challenges, which I sum up with the word populism, and that liberals have to start thinking differently in all kinds of ways. Yes, I'm presenting some past resources, as Sabina pointed out, but it's past resources that are presented very much in the service of what has to be a new liberal project. We have to do 4.0. 3.0 will not work, and nor can we simply call to go back to 1.0 or 2.0 or whoever your personal liberal hero or heroine might be in the past. And so this is the general political theorist kind of audience. And my current project, Democratic Liberalism, if this book is 80% history and 20% political theory, the other one is flipping those proportions, trying to, as many other people are, to work on the appropriate Liberalism 4.0 for the 21st century.
All right. Thank you, Alan, for this plea for reinventing and renewing liberalism. I think we are spot on now with the time. So thank you very much for that. And as the title of your book, it's still an incomplete history. So the task is ours now to, write its future, I guess. So much burden, but we'll see. Thank you again to both of you, Alan and Sabina, for your contributions today. And thank you to all the audience again for sticking with us and discussing those topics. I think it was an enlightening discussion, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you to Karen again, and look out for the new announcements. There will be new events coming up. So have a nice evening and see you soon all.
Bye-bye.